Can we begin with item 1, which is membership update? Bruce?
Nothing specific to update under item 1 to this meeting. Generally speaking, July is the meeting we bring a report to where we're looking at membership and to ensure it still remains representative, and that would certainly be the intent again this year.
Okay, that's great. Moving on then, apologies for absence. I'm not aware of any. Kay, do we have any more?
Yes, I have apologies from Graham Atkins and from Andrew Thelwell, but Darren Warburton is attending in place of Andrew.
Okay, welcome, Darren. Anyone aware of any other apologies? Okay, disclosure of interest, if any? No, we don't usually have any. So we can move into item 4, which is minutes and matters arising. We'll go through this and can ask you to comment on matters of accuracy and matters arising at the same time. Starting with page 1, the attendees. Page 2. We talked about membership update, and I know Audrey was going to. Or was it David that was going to do something in 75.1, but as Bruce has said, that will come back to the July meeting. 77.1 in for the benefit of Graham in particular. Is anything more to say about Bright Tribe, or do we just leave that there for future reference?
I think leave it there for future reference, Colin. There is no further update.
Nothing's happening. Okay. 78.2. We did manage to make some comment on that paper to the F40 group, and they have thanked us for that. So can I thank those who contributed and for officers for pulling that together. Just moving on. Anything else on page 2? Page 3. Oh, sorry.
Incoming call from 07.
Sorry, that was my Alexa telling me that the call was coming in. Alexa gets.
I'm sure there's 12 mobile phones just being switched to silent as well, Colin. I wouldn't worry about it.
Alexa's just spoken to me as don't mention the name, Colin. She'll come back with a question. Sorry, we're on to page 3. Any comments on page 3? No. Page 4.
The DSG report, obviously there is a specific paper on that on today's agenda.
Yeah. And just looking at 79.7, Sue, you said that you'd come back at some point with a report on growth.
School
yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
yeah, I'll do that in July, Colin. The report just going to fax next week, so we'll get approval and then we'll bring it through to schools for in July.
Okay, excellent. Anything more on?
Sorry, Chair, can I just ask that people mute their microphones if they haven't already done so? If they're not speaking, there's just a little bit of interference on the sound.
Okay, everyone. Anything more on page 5? Into page 6. Things mentioned there are covered in the paper that we're going to read on the DSG. Page 7. Page 8. 79.32.
Morning, everybody. Colin, I think that's referring to myself. I'm I'm more than happy and prepared to give some verbal feedback on how COVID has impacted on the early years sector as a whole and some parts of it individually. I don't know if it's appropriate to do that now or whether you want to finish the minutes or slot it into another part of the agenda.
Can we take it now, David? Thank you.
Yeah, of course, no problems. Okay, so as we'll all be aware, significant number of challenges for the early years sector throughout COVID, for all of the sectors, of course. We've got 108 of our schools have nursery age children on their rolls or via community powers, but basically as a part of the school. That sector of the market has been supported through the general support to schools collectively. So, you know, what's impacted on them and how their staff have managed and so on over time has been managed via the school support mechanisms. On top of that, we've got 274 private providers. Wow. Who are in receipt of funded ed, so that they have children who are eligible to have some time, either 15 or 30 hours education at an early years setting, and the support network for them has been directed through the early years team. So each of the 274 providers was provided with a sort of a direct buddy specifically for COVID issues, of which you'll understand there have been many. There's been distributions of PPE from a practical standpoint to each and all of those settings, and the possibility of more as they have needed it. There's been a significant amount of work and support around trying to get them to open in a COVID safe manner, so keeping their environments COVID safe. And they've run into exactly the same issues that lots of the schools have had. Yes, they're of course attempting to do the hand washing, put ventilation, much more routine and regular cleaning operations. But obviously, in this part of the sector, social distancing was never really on the cards actually, and the guidance. To be fair to the guidance, does say social distancing where possible, and I think that is a hint towards the earlier sector where social distancing is not possible. So a variety of challenges, and in terms of additional support and trying to ensure that folk are as sustainable as possible. The way that they've been funded over the terms is as follows. So through the summer and autumn terms 2020, the settings were funded on I'll call it a like-for-like basis, funding basis, in that we looked at previous years and funded them accordingly. And we did so regardless of whether they were actually open or closed throughout the period. Okay. And that was in line with national policy and certainly council policy of supporting any of our contractors, if you like, through COVID, in that we had the funding, central government paid the funding. So even though possibly a lot of the children were at home for various reasons and obvious reasons, we continued to fund the settings because they still had bills to pay, they still had their rent to pay, they still had the staff to pay. In many cases, although many did access the furlough scheme also, but we were obviously at different points in time. We've been requesting that they support disadvantaged youngsters throughout the piece, just as schools have done, and so the funding streams we've attempted to do it like for like with previous years. And there was also opportunities for them if their particular setting was very different to previous years, or they were expecting it would have been very different, then actually there was a process, in a mop-up process, for them to sort of apply for additional funding that they would have had to keep them going had we done a full census, which wasn't required at the time. Just to note, actually, for the spring term funding is is back to a census basis. So settings and schools are being paid on the basis of those children that they've actually got in school or in their setting. And obviously that's related to the fact that since January the 1st, early years sector has been expected to have all children in attendance, which we may or may not have a view on as to whether that was appropriate or not, but that is the way that we've been running. Other financial support that's come has been through a combination of grants. Initially, the first one was business rates. So anybody in any business in the council who was operating under a business rates and had a business rates number could apply for a £10,000 grant. Not all early years settings paid business rates. You know, if you rent your space from a church or a community centre, you don't have business rates, and that's a high proportion of the sector. And childminders, it's not business rates, etc., etc. For most, some childminders do have private premises, but most are in their own homes. So following that, additional money that came into local authority to support businesses was dedicated to the early years sector, and there's actually been 2 rounds of grants available. Both were for PVIs, £5,000, and then a second round with another £5,000. The criteria was relatively straightforward. They needed to prove that they were not getting as much money through the doors and that they were open to take any demand that was there. And so they could apply for and take those grants on board. Childminders had a £500 and £500 grant just to reflect the differences in sizes of the business. Other support that's ongoing currently, the availability of tests for the early years sector have been a little bit slow and behind those for the testing provided for schools. The expectation to date has been that the PVIs staff would get testing via community testing centres. We've got several community testing centres set up across the county now. Doesn't necessarily mean that there's one close to Wooler or what have you. So that still remains a challenge. But I was really pleased to see that on Monday, the details that came from the DFE was that home testing kits were going to be provided for the PVI sector, I think starting the 22nd of March. So that was a positive and something we've actually been lobbying for since the 9th of January. I think I was in a meeting where I just said the solutions home testing kits, can we just get them to the early years sector as quickly as possible, please? So eventually we've got around to that point in time, which is a good thing. I think the root of the question, as well as giving you all that background as how they've been supported to date, is really around sufficiency going forwards and sustainability as well. So the council has a statutory duty to ensure sufficiency of childcare, and that's 0 to 8 actually. Now, as it happens, currently we are meeting the demands of the residents, so there is enough sufficiency in the childcare sector to meet need, and occasionally we need to throw in a bit of support to try and get maybe a particular family sorted with a particular type of placement. But there is sufficiency. There are lower numbers attending, so that is hitting the sector. If the funded ed children, there are less attending. Having said that, this term we're looking at about 90% of our usual uptake. So it's not been decimated. Some areas might have been hit more than others, of course. There's always individuals that are hit one way or another. We've certainly got less 2-year-olds taking up, which is a concern and an issue, because 2-year-old take up is for our most disadvantaged youngsters and families. We don't have an overall view about private provision. The assumption is that it's down, but we're also aware anecdotally though of who've got less funded children but have made up by maybe getting in some private provision on top. So for example, they're not getting the 2-year-olds in, so they've actually changed the model a little bit and are providing something for under 8s. maybe wrap around or after, so they're getting another income stream in to support where they're at. There have been some closures that they've been related more to. There are some folk who some of the businesses were struggling already, and COVID has brought an end to it. We've had some retirements. Some of those people might say that they were retiring early because of the circumstances, but that's you know, on individual circumstances. It's not widespread. But at the same time, we've also had some new starting up.
Very good.
So you know, as far as sufficiency is concerned, there is currently enough. The worry going forwards is that if people have changed the model from 2-year-olds to something else to keep the wolf from the door at the moment, then will they be able to switch back when 2-year-old demand goes back up again? So that's something we're monitoring. We're obviously supporting the new starters and anyone that's there at the moment. Money in this sector is always tight, but they're very, very flexible workforce and do adjust to what's there or thereabouts, but we are conscious we need to support them as much as possible. And there'll be some comments later on in the funding rates for next year and the allocation of the early years block going forwards, which is in paper we'll be presenting later on in the meeting. I'm open to any questions.
Okay, that's very comprehensive, David. Any questions for David, please? I was hoping Debbie would be here, but I can't see her name on the attendees list. Debbie Wiley? No. Okay, I have to say, David, that's a lot more comprehensive than I feared it was. And certainly from my point of view, I accept that this is a volatile situation, and unfortunately a lot of things are going to come out inevitably are going to have to come out in the wash as time goes on. But it does sound as if you have your finger on the issues. Any other questions or comments for David? Okay, thank you very much, David. That's good. Thank you for that. So we're still on matters arising. Any further points on page 8? Okay. Can we accept those minutes as accurate?
Chair, yeah, accepted, agree.
Okay, thank you. And I shall sign them with many others when I get them from Kay, who I think is going to post them out to me. Moving on then to item 5, communication. Bruce?
Thank you, Chair. We've highlighted the little bit out of left field, the consultation from the DfE in relation to the national funding formula that was launched without any sort of a prior announcement on the 10th of February. It closes on the 24th of March. And again, looks at the elements that make up the high needs funding formula. Circulated with the paper was the 41-page consultation document. Now, it may be to the disappointment of Forum that we don't go through that page by page now, but the suggestion is we have a high needs committee meeting on the 10th of March, which is prior to the closure of the consultation. If anybody has any specific points to make, please either forward them either to a high needs committee member or to myself, and we'll ensure that they're fed into the high needs meeting on the 10th of March. Happy to take any queries or other observations in relation to the consultation.
That did seem to come out of the blue. Bruce, is there any sort of feeling as to why, or is it just swamped by many other more urgent things at the moment?
Well, the only one potential suggestion would be that the deprivation is a significant factor within the high needs funding formula. And obviously there's a lot happening around deprivation, both with the review of ADACI, which is now fed through the formula, plus also some coverage in terms of free school meals currently. Whether or not that's been a factor or whether or not it's simply a question of the DFE are picking up because of the, to be fair, the significant pressures on high needs, but also the significant additional investment that's been made in high needs. Who's to say?
Okay. Any questions or comments on that? Otherwise, we'll leave it to the High Needs Committee. Okay.
There's a couple of hands up. I'm conscious, Chair, from Richard and Graham.
Yeah, Richard.
Mic's off, Richard.
I didn't read the whole thing through in huge detail, but I'm always looking for good news in these strange times. And I just turned to the end of the paper, and Northumberland didn't look to be doing too badly. Is this good news potentially or not?
I think I'm cautious at this point. Again, we know through the last 2 years of the budget settlement, our demands for high needs, as measured predominantly through the number of plans, has increased significantly. And until last year, funding certainly hadn't kept pace with that. There is still a reluctance from the DFE to reflect high needs plans in the figures. Sorry, as an element within the formula. So hopefully there may be additional funding reflecting our needs, but let's wait and see.
Thank you.
We'll certainly, in terms of, reflect that in our consultation response, Richard.
Okay, Graham?
Yes, Chair, thank you. As Chair of the High Needs Committee, I would urge all your members of the school forum to look at this document and obviously complete it if you can, right? And if you've got comments, please send them in to, obviously, through Bruce or myself, right? So we can actually, discuss what your concerns at the High Needs Committee on the 10th. So if you could do that, please do it. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, David has just said that David Street that he has to leave at 10:30 and is asking if there are any questions on early years funding from item 6, which we're just about to go to. Actually, Colin.
We can go to that item first, Colin, if that's appropriate.
Okay, is there anything more on communications, Bruce?
No, nothing else under communications. Thank you.
Right, well, we'll move into item 6 and pick up David's question about any questions on early years funding. Bruce, can you point us to the?
It's section 6 of the report, which commences on page 5.
Yep. Okay. Any questions, specific questions on the high needs block? Graham, your hand's still up. And your mic's off.
Looks like it's down now.
All right, thank you. Okay.
Would it be useful if I just gave a very quick summary?
Yes, it
quicker
would.
than my summary from before.
Thank you, David.
For historically, we have Northumberland has been the amongst the lowest funded for early years. So our actual total hourly rates have always been at the national minimum, and that continues. So we come from a very, very low base, but through the 3- and 4-year-old universal and extended 30 hours offer, the rates have started to creep up, but still significantly behind some other parts of the country that are looking at £6 and £7 an hour. So compared to our 3- and 4-year-old rate of £4, was £4.38 last year, but is now increased to £4.44. It's going in the right direction, obviously, but just to remind everyone, we are at the national minimum. We've always passed through as much as humanly possible of the early years block directly to the providers, be those schools or the PVIs or the childminders. The rules are that we can retain up to 5%, but I think historically, again, we run at about 3.7, 3.8%, and that money that is retained supports the early years team to do some of the work we was talking about before, and provide that additional support often to folk who are working on their own. We've looked, I won't give it every bit of detail, but we've looked to see how we can maximise the funding rates. We've got a full breakdown in the annexes at the end of the report as to exactly how the block has been distributed. We just get an estimated figure for the year to start with, and there is some interest this year, obviously, as it's based on January census. Even though I said we're getting up to about 90% for this term of what we were expecting, it's still lower than normal. So as a result, because the final allocation will be based on what we get in January this year, the 17.5 million that we're predicting might be a bit less than that. The funding rates are recorded that were proposed for 2021 are in the table at the bottom of the section there.
21, 22.
So even though the total figure we get is 444 for 3 and 4 year olds, I mentioned that one because it is the highest grossing area. We're proposing to pass on £4.24 to the providers. For 3 and 4 year olds, we pass on every penny. There's a 100% pass through rate for the 2 year old rate, which is now at £5.36. The early years pupil premium is fully passed on at the point of 53 pence per hour. And you remember from last year, we have a deprivation payment within the formula, and we changed the way that had been allocated and added it on to make it a pupil premium plus figure. So the standard national rate for pupil premium, early years pupil premium, is 53 pence. But the proposal is that we continue to pay an additional 75 pence to that figure, which could mean that a 3 and 4 year old rate, if you were a pupil premium early years child, starts to add up to be quite a substantial figure, or at least something to keep people's head above water. The alternative to that is if you have very few pupil premium children, then you are stuck at the £4.24 level, and that can be a challenge. So the last note there is just the proposal is to pass on the 6 pence uplift directly on, and the 8 pence uplift for 2 year olds directly onto the providers, and keep everything else pretty much the same.
David, sorry, before I take any more comments, David, where other areas of the country are so much ahead of us in terms of the rates, how do they manage that? Are these areas supplemented from the broader council budget?
No, we are talking about central government funding direct into the early years block. It's a bums on seats model, but they get a much higher rate. There is a national funding formula, but the national funding formula takes into account some of the area cost adjustments, which I've asked many times to fully understand, but I've yet to be given a good explanation of what area cost adjustments are. It's not solely on this, but it does appear the further south in the country you are, the higher the rates that are paid. Not in all cases, mind. There are some unusual ones that stand out a little bit, but you know, in Sunderland, they do get a significantly higher rate than us,
right,
under the formula.
Okay, I can't add to that. Any other questions for David? Okay, David, thank you very much for that.
I think Richard's just jumped in there.
Oh yes, Richard.
Just an observation. I know, David, you worked very hard on trying to get this sorted out, and it's pleasing to see how much funding you've managed to get where it's needed. You are suggesting there might be problems going forward next year. with the 90% figure. Is there anything that Forum's in a position to do in terms of writing to anybody in terms of that position and or Northumberland's low level? Because I've got a vague understanding of area cost adjustments, but that surely ought to include something about, say, sparsity, for example. So basically, thanks very much, David. Is there anything we can do to help?
We're in discussions with DFE as we speak in and around their financial boffins, as it were, and how they're allocating for next year. Because some of the team were in really close contact with the early years entitlements DFE team, who are trying to work their way through this. To be honest, they're not quite making it up on the hoof, but there does seem to be a lot of communication. So if you just bear with us until those discussions are finalised and we know what the final picture is going to look like. And then I'll come back to you. But I think it would be useful to highlight the disparity in the rates, because that's a long-standing issue.
Thank you.
Thanks, David, and thanks for raising that, Richard. Any other questions for David? Okay, David, thank you very much. Can we then go to the beginning of this paper under item 6, and Bruce, would you take us through from the beginning? Okay,
thanks, Colin. Again, none of this should be coming as a surprise to any forum member. Following on, it's very much following on from the discussions and agreements we've made at the last couple of meetings in November and January. What we're doing at this point, though, is just agreeing the overall individual elements of the DSG as far as we're able to at this point, noting discussions we've had, such as the example around EY, where their figures, are subsequently amended according to later January census information. Again, we previously highlighted at the bottom of page 1, agreed, and I think there was some unanimity around the two-step approach towards the adoption of national funding formula, where we've closed the gap in half for the 21-22 figures. Again, I think, again, what that does is supports the schools who previously received lower funding around prior lower attainment, while also offering that degree of protection to be fair, all of our schools which have benefited historically from higher ARPU rates than is the case with national funding formula. And last but certainly not least, Schools Forum have long since been advocates of a smooth transition to national funding formula, and hopefully that's very much helping us achieve that. I think, as recorded in the minutes and highlighted in the last meeting, there was a slight difference in the final funding figure we got through, which meant essentially there was £202.1 million for distribution compared to the 201.8 million, which had been used in all of our modelling. Careful consideration has gone into how that funding should be used. What we didn't want to do is sort of go back on any of the key principles we've agreed around the two-step approach, but there were a couple of areas which it seemed appropriate to tweak in order to fully allocate funding and maximise the number of beneficiaries involved. The first area was in relation to the free school meals factor. We have been able, I'm happy to report, to increase the free school meals factor from £510 to £570 per pupil across both primary and secondary. That was also a reflection of a decision taken in terms of wider by the ESFA in relation to the distribution of pupil premium, which there has been some comments on. Historically, January census figures had been used for the distribution of pupil premium from the following April, but there's been a decision where essentially they're going to use October figures in line with October census figures, which are also used for the distribution of the subsequent funding formula, which is the work we've been doing over the past few months. If free school meal figures are stable, that wouldn't represent an issue, but because of the impact of COVID, we have seen a steady increase in the free school meal figures over the past 3 months between October and January, as outlined in the report. So in respect of that, simply because schools have an immediate commitment to meet the additional costs of children qualifying for free school meals, it seemed appropriate to increase that formula factor in respect of that. Okay, again, there's further information about pupil premium at the link there, should anybody be interested in terms of the changes. Moving on, the second item essentially was around, again, more general, a more general factor. Given that we are moving towards national funding formula, members are aware that we have used capping and scaling to maintain some of those formula factors previously, which are over and above national funding formula levels, such as the age-weighted pupil unit, the OPU values. We can only do that through the use of capping and scaling, and we originally set the figures at 4% for capping and then 50% for scaling. What that means in practical terms is any gains over and above 4% would be scaled back. I don't know why I need my hands to do that, would be scaled back by 50% for that. What we were able to do in the overall funding package was increase that threshold from 4% to 4.65% while balancing the overall numbers. So again, that seemed an appropriate step to take, which again enables schools to retain more funding before that scaling level would apply.
Okay, can I stop you there, Bruce?
Yeah.
I've, from my point of view, I think welcome factors there, but they're reasonably technical. Anybody want to ask specifically about the increase in the free school meals factor and the change in the capping and scaling? Okay, I think then, Bruce, we note that we note those changes. You know, certainly I think they're welcome. Could I just ask you to emphasise the last sentence, the last line of the element on free school meals, where you make the point that this does not commit us to any future change in that respect.
Yes, indeed, Colin, and thanks for highlighting that. I think it's important to say that that really is it's potentially a one-off change for this year because of the late introduction and change to the pupil premium factor. Any further changes to free school meals in the future and any decision to maintain a free school meals value at levels above national funding formula will in future need to be, entirely subject to, affordability, as we say in the report.
Yeah. Smashing. Thanks. Carry on then, Bruce, if you would. Okay,
moving on, page 3. As I say, we gladly, after some exchange with the SFA, we've received confirmation that they agreed the approach and the submission of the formula for value submitted. So that's essentially where we are in relation to that. And the formula factors are in table 1 on the following page. Just a couple of other things to highlight in relation to schools block. 4.3, essentially we previously said we were unlikely to be making any contribution to the growth fund during the 21-22 financial year. However, as admission patterns and catchment needs emerged, we are in discussions in 2 areas about pressures that have emerged both at Year 5 in Morpeth and Year 7 in Bedlington. We need to ensure that we have sufficient provision, in the catchment areas and in the schools for the local population, and we have felt it necessary to set aside figures in relation to the potential additional 1 forms in those schools to reflect demand in that respect. We're having ongoing discussions with the schools involved and hope to make an early decision, which is obviously to the advantage of all concerned, but we need the agreement of partner schools in respect of that.
When would that change take place? From September, Bruce?
That would be from September, and we'd allocate the funding from September as well.
Okay. Any questions on that particular element? Okay, carry on, Bruce.
Okay. And last but not least, in relation to that, we've circulated a draft budget funding statement document. Again, it was drafted at this point. It was really about if there were any discussions from the respective members in relation to format. What we're hoping to do this year is add a very short, maybe one-page covering letter, just highlighting some of the discussions we've had at Schools Forum and some of the decisions we've taken as we move towards national funding formula, just to provide that little bit of context to schools. Once agreed and once finalised, that will go out to schools in the next day or two. Thus meeting our requirement to inform schools of their budget shares by the 28th of February.
Okay.
Can we ask if there are any specific comments? I've kindly had a comment from Faye Keelder this morning, which was much appreciated. If there are any other comments in relation to the budget statements.
And are we happy to note as in 4.5? Okay, I think we're happy with that, Bruce. Thank you.
Okay.
Moving on.
Moving on, top of page 5, we're now dealing with a high needs block. Again, we've informed Schools Forum at the last meeting of the indicative high needs block funding value. Mike, thanks for that question. There is sparsity in the figures for 21-22. That draft statement went out. I have to put that one down to a spreadsheet error. Sparsity has been allocated to figures, and the final figures will reflect that. The sparsity is reflected in the overall total grant figures at the bottom. There has just been a problem about that pulling through to the individual sparsity line. But yeah, thanks. That was something Fiona highlighted as well. Thank you for that. Essentially, the high needs block. I think what we're demonstrating on an ongoing basis in relation to the high needs block, and forum members will recall that we've consistently reduced the deficit over the last 3 years, and I think really it's probably helpful to go to that Appendix B where we've set the proposed budget for 21-22. First of all, I think it's important we understand the top block in terms of the funding. 41.902 is 41.902 million is the total gross allocation. Before we see any of that, there is that 2 deductions that are made immediately from our allocation. The 2.512 million is in respect of placements in further education and other sort of non-maintained schools and other supported providers who are supported directly by the ESFA. We then have a further £1 million deduction in respect of a net export of students. Again, members may recall the references made to the import-export adjustment. Essentially, that means we have more pupils going out of county to study than we have coming in, and out of county in this instance also includes to ESFA registered providers such as non-maintained schools. So essentially we have a further, and so we lose place funding in respect of that. So we lose a further £1 million in respect of the net effect of that. We then show the transfer in from the schools block to high needs block, which leaves us essentially £39.3 million to allocate. The blue and green block essentially shows how that £39.3 million is being allocated for the forthcoming year. And it's essentially, again, a total expenditure of £39.373 million, which again broadly balances. A couple of important things to highlight. Without the schools transfer, there would nevertheless be a deficit of just over £1 million. including the brought forward deficit. When we adjust for the brought forward deficit, that figure comes down to just over £414,000. And that's the challenge for the council, essentially, as we work through 21-22 to work as how we can close that gap and provide a balanced budget for 22-23 on an ongoing basis, which again is not a insignificant challenge given the high need pressures we're all aware of. But again, importantly, what we're showing at the bottom is a much reduced deficit as at the March 22 forecast position, down from 594,000 to 45,000. Again, the contribution from the schools block is a major factor in respect of that. Okay, so
yeah, I don't want to put anybody on the spot because I haven't primed anybody for this, but the challenges for 22-23, would Audrey or David like to reflect on that, or is that something for the future?
Apologies, Colin, I'm on mute and talking to you. I think it is something for the future. It's something we're working through at the moment. In particular, David and I are currently working with all of our schools around how we consider really carefully using our priorities and the work to do around high needs block, how we use that really to make sure that our children get the best package that's available for them, hopefully inside the county rather than outside of the county. That's our approach more generally. There may be obviously some specialist post-16 provision that we continue to see out there, but it's something that we're working through at the moment, and in particular working with Nicola and Sam and the SEN team and the commissioning team. Okay, yeah, right. Well, the best of luck on that. And can I ask Bruce or any of the officers, just, I may be making the wrong connection here, but if we go to the import-export adjustment at the top, is that likely to reduce when the new special school opens, or is that more a case of numbers rather than the nature of the specialism?
It's certainly correct to make the connection, Colin. We would hope that you'd see a reduction in that, but it will be over time. You know, and what the key thing is, what the opening of the new free school does is give us alternative placement options now, you know, or in a year's time, should I say anyway. Unless there was an alternative reason for the change in a child's placement, we wouldn't move people out directly from the current educational placement and new ones, but it's about changing those placement decisions over time so that more pupils are placed in borough in appropriate education, and we see, you know, a longer term reduction in that import-export figure. Yeah, okay, I get that. Thank you very much. Sorry, I interrupted there. Bruce, is there anything more you want to say? No, not at all. Actually, it's probably appropriate to highlight this point. I know Sam has joined us. That, you know, there is a SEN strategy out for consultation at the moment, which I've just checked on the website. It closes 5th of March. Clearly, you know, direction of travel around SEN, you know, is inextricably linked with the funding. So if forum members, you know, want to see that, that's on the council website, and I'm sure, you know, Sam would welcome any contributions or thoughts in relation to that. I've just realised essentially that the next high needs commit 18th of March. That's even better than most. I've picked up the wrong day from the website. It is the 18th of March, which does give our high needs committee a chance to respond. You know, when we meet on the 10th of March. So that's good news. Thanks, Sam. Okay. Are there any other questions in relation to the high needs budget? Moving on, we've picked up early years. David's sort of commented on that one already. Just moving through again, last again but not least, central school services block. As we've commented, I think at the last meeting, we did challenge the ESFA and secured some further funding in relation to the historic commitments in relation to both the prudential borrowing and termination of employment costs, and that's now been reflected in the figures. Again, we continue to assess and manage the implications of that. One of the pressures in relation to that is essentially around the long-term capital costs which were undertaken in respect of developments at Hexham Priory. That falls out of the formula equation within the next 18 months, I believe. Excuse me. So again, we have to manage the long-term impact. The DFE and the ESFA's long-term avowed policy has been the reduction of those historic commitments to zero. And we'll have to see what happens in respect of that, over the medium term. Okay.
That agitation, Bruce, to the ESFA has obviously been worthwhile, though. So carry on.
Okay, good. So again, Appendix A shows a final breakdown of the DSG allocation for 21-22, including the delegation summary. Appendix B has the high needs budget, and Appendix E shows the proposed use of the Central School Services block and how that is funded from both the historic and the ongoing commitment elements within that. That's essentially it in respect of item 6. Happy to pause, take any questions or observations anybody may have. In the absence of any further comments, can we just take that the recommendations that the respective budgets and funding formula figures are duly noted as requested in the recommendations at paragraph 2.
Okay, I think we can do that, Bruce. Can't see any hands up. Can I thank and congratulate officers for again bringing this through to a conclusion. It is a huge task. It always astonishes me each year as to the detail of thought that goes into this. So thank you indeed to everybody that's been involved. Okay, moving on to the work programme, and please don't dash away. I should have said at the beginning, there is a single item under any other business. So after we get to the work programme, I'll ask you to stay for another 5 minutes to discuss that item. But can we go to item 7, which is the work programme?
Yeah, work programme and meeting dates. In terms of schools forum dates are largely unchanged. I should probably highlight at this point that the holding of schools forum meetings as virtual meetings needed specific legislation that was put through early March last year, essentially, which enables us, permits us to meet virtually. That legislation was only applicable up till the 31st of March. I anticipate that will be extended, but we await the ESFA position in relation to that. Our next meeting is not scheduled until the 7th of July, by which point the world should hopefully be a much clearer and straightforward place, he says, with everything crossed accordingly. What I wanted to highlight in relation to the meeting dates is we've put together a programme of high needs committee meeting dates for the remainder of 2021, which it would be helpful for high needs committee members to put in their diary, commencing on Wednesday 10th of March, where we're going to have an interesting looking agenda, both in respect of the DFE consultation around the formula, the local consultation on the SEND strategy, and a couple of other elements as well by then, I'm sure. So it would be helpful for members to have those dates in their diary.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. From what you said at the beginning there, it sounds as if we can't adopt virtual meetings after the legislation has passed its
if you like.
date. Yeah, it's not an option that we have.
I think it's something that hasn't been looked at by the DFE yet.
Yeah.
You know, they haven't. They essentially extended the legislation for 12 months till the end of March to, in theory, get us through the COVID crisis. You know, I appreciate comments that are coming through there that actually the virtual format is proved extremely convenient and beneficial for some members, and certainly attendance has generally been excellent.
Yeah.
We will certainly, as Mike's requested, make that representation to the SFA.
Yeah.
How we would manage that blended, I don't know whether it would be possible to almost do a blended format where some could attend in person and some could attend virtually. I'm thinking of the new Saturday night panel shows where everybody has a virtual audience these days. I don't. We'll see how we can take that forward, Colin, and certainly make that representation to the SFA, which is, you know, again, I think again supported by Mike, Faye, and Ben. Certainly,
Quite.
I can see certainly in Northumberland's case how it's been extremely beneficial.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Anything more to add to that, anyone?
Colin, I was just going to say we've obviously, in terms of school admission appeals, we received the guidance yesterday that that's going to continue. So it looks like the DFE are working their way through the list, and obviously the more urgent ones are coming through first. So I'm sure we'll get the same guidance probably before the end of the week around our schools forum meetings.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. That's a good indication. Okay, moving on then to item 8, any other business? Bruce, you have a paper to add here.
Yes, and first and foremost, obviously, apologies to members that we haven't been able to circulate this paper in advance. But again, it's reflected in terms of the financial, you know, important review of the financial monitoring position, both in respect of the de-delegated funding. It's been I think the collective view of the department that, you know, recognising the pressures which school have been on and recognising what a unique year 2021 has been. In practice, there has been very little demand on the contingency sort of school reorganisation budget. Okay, thanks, David. So what in practice went through financial monitoring and worked with Abby, Audrey, Sue and the rest of the team, we've noticed that we're still holding a significant balance in terms of that contingency funding. The correct and appropriate thing to do in respect of that, and the what we're proposing is essentially that we're going to refund that funding to maintain school members. As laid out in the report I will present here, we will circulate this report immediately following the meeting. Hopefully members are looking at that report now in terms of return of 2021 de-delegated funding to maintain schools. Yeah. You will recall from the January meeting that we make a decision essentially around the de-delegation funding. In order to support schools, we reduced the de-delegated funding in relation to the behaviour support funding for 21-22, so there was less money being deducted at source from school budgets, if you like. We do have historically made a £20 per head deduction as in relation to potential costs arising from, as a contingency, potential costs arising from reorganisation. As we outline in terms of paragraph 4, there have been no significant demands on that contingency fund this year. It's been decided to return this funding to schools. It's important, we brought it to this meeting specifically because we felt it was important to return it to schools prior to the end of March, so it's reflected in their 2021 financial year end, their end of March figures, if you like. Again, this doesn't affect 21-22 de-delegation decisions. We'll review that again, you know, further as we get further into 21-22. What does that mean in terms of schools? Essentially, we'll make that refund by the end of March, so again, it gets reflected in their individual year-end school balances. There's essentially, we're refunding it on the same basis we've deducted it, on the basis of a £20 per pupil basis. It clearly impacts on larger schools far more significantly than smaller schools, but that's the way the deduction's made in the first place. Just again highlighting in relation to academies, academies don't have de-delegated funding deducted from them by the authority, so it doesn't affect academies, with the exception of those schools who academised during 2021, and what they will receive is a pro rata refund of their contributions because they academised midway through the year. They wouldn't have paid the full de-delegated funding, but will ensure that the appropriate contribution is returned to those. I think there's potentially up to 6 schools affected. Again, in terms of the appendix, there's a list of schools there and the impact of this refund. What we'll do is essentially show that in total, that's a total of £344,000. And it, again, does make a 5-figure impact on some of our larger schools. I don't know if any other officers have anything to add or anything they want to highlight in respect of that.
I'm sure that's a very welcome bonus, Bruce, for the schools involved.
As I say, we will work and ensure that those transfers go through, work with Abby and Corporate Finance to ensure those transfers go through certainly before the financial year end.
Very good. Okay, thank you for that. Are there any other items that anyone would like to raise? I haven't received any notice of them. Okay, thank you very much. Date of next meeting. A long time away on the 7th of July. My goodness. Let's hope things are rather different in the world by then. Okay, those of you I don't see over the summer, or the spring anyway, and into the summer, I hope it goes well for you all. And I will see a number of people at the high needs meetings in the very near future. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Okay, thanks, Colin.